The night they called me a disgrace is etched into my memory as clearly as if it happened only hours ago. I had spent weeks pressing the edges of my wedding invitations, folding them carefully, sealing them with trembling hands and hopeful thoughts. Each envelope represented a piece of my heart, but the one I clutched more tightly than the rest bore my parents' names. I had convinced myself that if they heard me speak, if they saw how much this moment meant, maybe they would soften. Maybe they would look at me not as the constant disappointment, but as their daughter, a woman finally worth celebrating. That Sunday evening, I walked into their house where laughter and chatter bounced against polished walls. The kind of warmth they reserved for one another always seemed to wither whenever I entered the room. My palms were damp as I approached the dining table, the envelope pressed against my chest like a fragile shield. The conversations dulled to silence. Faces turned toward me with the kind of pause that reminded me of my role, an outsider within my own bloodline. I placed the invitation in front of them. My voice cracked when I said the word wedding, but I smiled anyway, forcing brightness into the air. For a split second, I thought my father might take the envelope gently, as though it mattered. Instead, he dragged it toward him, tore it straight down the middle, then again and again until the pieces fluttered across the table like fallen leaves. My mother leaned back in her chair, her mouth curled into disapproval. "A disgrace," she spat, her voice cutting like a knife. Around the table, cousins laughed quietly. My older sister smirked behind the rim of her wine glass, diamonds flashing in the light. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, humiliation searing through me while my heart collapsed under the weight of their contempt. I wanted to speak. I wanted to defend my love, to tell them that Daniel was the one person who had ever stood by me with kindness. But my throat closed, my words suffocated before they reached air. I gathered the scraps of the shredded invitation with shaking hands, each piece a reminder of how little they valued me. Memories rushed back like fragments of broken glass. My 8th birthday, when my mother scolded me for not smiling as beautifully as my sister. The high school graduation where my parents left halfway through my speech to attend her recital. Every Christmas and Thanksgiving where my presence was little more than an afterthought. That night at the table, my father pushed away his plate as though I had spoiled his appetite, and my mother dismissed me with a wave of her hand. I wanted them to see me, to call after me, to ask me to stay. But when I turned toward the door, all I heard was the clink of silverware and the hum of resumed conversation, as if I had never been there at all. Outside, the cool evening air mixed with the hot sting of tears sliding down my cheeks. I pressed the torn invitation against my chest and walked to my car, my steps heavy with decades of rejection. For a moment, I let their words seep into my bones. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was a disgrace. Yet as I sat alone behind the wheel, another thought stirred, small but steady. Maybe this was not the end of my story with them. Maybe this was only the beginning of something greater. They believed they had silenced me, but what they had done was light a fire. One day, that fire would burn so brightly it would blind them, and they would regret every cruel word, every cold dismissal, every torn piece of paper. The week after my invitation was shredded, I carried the sting of their rejection like a fresh wound. Each morning when I woke, the memory replayed in painful detail, as though my father's hands were still tearing the paper, my mother's voice still echoing that single word, disgrace. I tried to bury it, but the world had a cruel way of reminding me where I stood. One morning, I opened my phone and saw my family's celebration splashed across every feed. They had thrown my sister Allison a birthday party so extravagant it could have been mistaken for a royal affair. The backyard glowed beneath strings of golden lights, crystal glasses sparkled on long tables, and a towering cascade of champagne shimmered in the center. My sister stood radiant in a designer gown, a crown of praise wrapped around her by every caption and comment. "Our pride and joy," my mother had written beneath one photo. "The daughter who makes us proud every single day," my father added. I stared at the screen until my chest ached. No message had come inviting me to the party. No phone call, no casual mention. Once again, I had been left invisible, erased from the family portrait. I told myself not to look, but I could not stop scrolling. I watched Allison unwrap luxury handbags, gold bracelets, and silk dresses while relatives raised glasses in her honor. Their smiles gleamed like polished silver, while the memory of my last birthday surfaced uninvited. A curt message from my mother that said only, "Hope it's a good one." The difference was a knife twisting deeper with every photograph. But what unsettled me more than their blatant favoritism was the suspicion that grew with each image. Allison had just announced the launch of a charitable foundation, one she claimed was dedicated to scholarships and community programs. She had been praised as generous, selfless, the beacon of compassion. Yet here she was, draped in luxury and hosting parties that looked more like coronations. Where was the money truly coming from? I wasn't ready then to expose her, nor did I want to. But a thought took root. My parents had built her pedestal on the image of perfection. If that image cracked even slightly, their entire facade could crumble. I shut off my phone that night, sitting in silence with tears burning hot in my eyes. It wasn't the party I mourned. It was the message, spoken without words but loud enough for the world to hear. Allison was the pride, and I was the burden. They did not want me in their photos, their celebrations, or their stories. I was a ghost, a shadow standing just outside the glow of their spotlight. And yet, even as the ache hollowed me out, another feeling stirred. I realized I no longer craved their approval. I no longer wanted to fight for scraps of affection. What I wanted was different, sharper, more powerful. I wanted the day to come when they would see me not as a shadow, but as a light so brilliant they could not look away. The birthday party, so grand and glittering, became more than another night I was excluded. It was the moment I began to understand the pedestal beneath Allison was not as sturdy as it seemed. Cracks were forming, small and silent for now. But one day those cracks would widen, and the golden image they worshipped would shatter before their very eyes. Daniel held me close that evening, his hand steady against mine as I confessed how deeply it cut. He did not try to fix it, nor did he offer false comfort. He simply said, "They have chosen their golden child, but that does not make you any less. One day, Rebecca, they will learn what they lost." His voice was calm, but beneath it I heard a certainty that soothed the storm raging in my chest. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that he might be right. Perhaps one day the world would see me not as the daughter discarded, but as the woman who rose above it all. And when that day came, their pride would not matter, because their silence would be louder than anything they could ever say. Rumors spread like wildfire in the weeks that followed, each one cutting deeper than the last. I would walk into a cafe and feel the stares prick at my skin. Friends who once shared secrets with me now avoided my eyes, whispering behind their hands when I passed. At first, I could not understand where the sudden coldness came from. Then one afternoon, a message popped up on my phone, a screenshot sent by an old classmate. The words were cruel, neatly written across a glowing screen. They said Daniel was a fraud, a man without a job, living off me like a leech. They said I was desperate enough to marry someone who could not provide, that I was willing to settle because no one else would have me. The sender of those words was none other than Allison. My sister's fingerprints were all over the venom, her carefully chosen phrases designed to strike the deepest wound. My heart raced as I scrolled through the endless comments beneath her post. Cousins chimed in with sly remarks. Family friends nodded along. Even people I once trusted had added laughing emojis, as if my pain were entertainment. Each sentence branded me with humiliation, but beneath the fire of shame a quieter truth pulsed. Allison had been waiting for this moment, orchestrating it with the precision of a conductor. She had not been satisfied tearing me down privately. Now she wanted the world to laugh with her. That night, I confronted Daniel. My voice trembled as I told him what she had done, how everyone was mocking us. I braced myself for anger, for denial, for the kind of storm that might tear us apart. Instead, Daniel listened quietly, his expression calm, his hand reaching for mine. He said nothing at first, and the silence felt heavier than words. Then he smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that held secrets. Let them laugh for now, Rebecca, he murmured. The truth will silence them soon enough. I frowned, confusion sparking through my fear. What truth? But he only squeezed my hand and kissed my forehead, as though promising me a revelation in its own time. I wanted to press him for answers, yet his calmness wrapped around me like a blanket. In that moment, I trusted him more deeply than ever before. Still, the days that followed were hard. Invitations to dinners stopped arriving. A friend I had known since childhood canceled on me with no explanation. Even at work, colleagues whispered as I walked by, their smiles too tight to be genuine. Everywhere I turned, Allison's narrative followed me like a shadow. My parents, of course, embraced it with open arms. My mother's message arrived late one evening. This is why we said you were a disgrace. Marrying a man like him proves it. I cried until my eyes were raw, but when the tears finally subsided, I felt something else: resolve. If Daniel was right, if he carried a truth strong enough to silence them all, then I would hold on to that hope until it came. Because deep down, I knew the man who held me through every storm was not the parasite they painted him to be. I had seen his kindness, his strength, the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world who mattered. That was not the gaze of a man who used or deceived. That was love, real and steady, and I would not let them poison it. So I stood taller, even when my voice shook. I met the whispers with silence, the stares with a lifted chin. My family thought they had written the story of my shame, but they had only written the prologue. The real story, the one that would change everything, was still waiting to be told. The night Daniel revealed his truth is one I will never forget. We were sitting on the balcony of our small apartment, the city lights flickering in the distance like scattered jewels. I had been quiet all evening, the weight of my family's ridicule pressing heavily on my shoulders. Daniel handed me a cup of tea, his movements unhurried, his eyes steady on mine. Then, with the calm certainty of a man who had nothing to prove, he said, "It is time you know who I really am." My breath caught. For weeks, I had clung to his earlier promise, the cryptic assurance that the truth would silence them. Now, here it was, sitting between us in the cool night air. He leaned back in his chair, his voice low but firm as he spoke of the life he had hidden from the world. Daniel was not the struggling man my sister mocked. He was the founder and chief executive of a company that had quietly grown into one of the most powerful firms in the country. He described boardrooms filled with politicians, world leaders, and visionaries who sought his counsel. He told me of investments that stretched across continents, of projects worth billions shaping industries and futures. At first, the words felt unreal, like a dream spun out of fiction. I stared at him, my mind struggling to connect the man who cooked me breakfast, who carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs, with the figure he described. But then I saw it, the quiet confidence that had always been there, the ease with which he carried himself, the certainty in his decisions. The pieces fit together at last, and I realized I had never truly known the full scope of the man who loved me. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against my trembling ones. "I hid this because I wanted to be sure you loved me for me, not for what I could give," he explained. "And you have. You have stood by me when the world turned its back. That is why you are the only one I want beside me when we share this truth with everyone." Tears blurred my vision, not from shock, but from the overwhelming sense of vindication. All the cruel words, all the whispers of disgrace, all the laughter at my expense, they would not survive this revelation. For the first time in my life, I felt the scales shift, power tilting away from those who had belittled me and toward the man who had chosen me above all else. In the days that followed, preparations for our wedding took on a new meaning. Daniel revealed the estate in Malibu where the ceremony would be held, a sprawling property overlooking the ocean, valued at more money than I could comprehend. He showed me the guest list. Leaders, artists, celebrities, entrepreneurs, people whose names were spoken with reverence around the world. The wedding would not be a simple celebration. It would be a statement, one broadcast to millions, a declaration of who we were and what we stood for. When I held the invitation in my hands, printed on paper so fine it felt like silk. I thought of the one my father had shredded. The memory still stung, but this new invitation carried a different weight. This was not just an invitation to a wedding. It was proof. Proof that I was not the disgrace they claimed, but the woman chosen by a man whose name commanded respect in every corner of the globe. I closed my eyes and imagined the look on their faces when they discovered the truth. They would come, of course. They would try to bask in the glow of the spectacle, to claim a place in a story they had once mocked. But the world would know, and for once, my family would not be able to twist the narrative. The truth would shine too brightly for their lies to survive. That night, as Daniel held me close, I whispered the words that had been buried inside me for so long. Let them see. Let them finally see who I am. He kissed the top of my head, and in that quiet moment, I knew the time of shadows was ending. The light was about to rise, and nothing could stop it. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of brilliance that made the ocean sparkle like scattered diamonds. I stood at the window of the estate in Malibu, watching waves crash against the cliffs far below, the air filled with the sound of gulls and the scent of salt. The mansion behind me pulsed with activity. Designers hurried through hallways, florists arranged blooms in cascading arches, chefs whispered instructions in the kitchen. It felt like a dream, one so far removed from the life my family had painted for me that I wondered if I might wake at any moment. My gown shimmered in the soft light, every stitch hand-sewn, the fabric flowing like water around me. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I almost did not recognize myself. For the first time, I saw not the forgotten daughter, not the shadow of a golden child, but a woman standing tall, radiant, ready to walk into a new life. My heart raced, not from nerves, but from the anticipation of what was to come. This day was not only about love, though love was at its center. It was also about truth, about vindication, about stepping into the light after years of being cast aside. Guests began arriving hours before the ceremony. Cars pulled up one after another, sleek black vehicles carrying leaders, innovators, artists, and icons. Cameras flashed as they stepped onto the red-carpeted path, their laughter and greetings filling the air. Journalists scribbled notes, reporters murmured into microphones, broadcasts streamed live to millions of viewers across the country. Each arrival raised the anticipation higher, the spectacle more grand than anything I had ever dared to imagine. And then, as expected, my family appeared. They arrived dressed in their finest, their smiles wide, their confidence radiating. They believed, I am certain, that they would glide effortlessly into the celebration, their presence assumed to be welcome. But the guards at the gate held their hands up, scanning the guest list with precise eyes. My parents' names were not there. Neither were Allison's nor my cousin's. Confusion rippled across their faces, quickly replaced by indignation. My mother demanded entry, insisting she was the bride's mother. My father's voice rose, booming with anger, accusing the staff of incompetence. Allison tried to slip through. Her designer heels clicking impatiently, her expression twisted with disbelief. But the guards did not waver. Cameras turned toward the scene, capturing every moment as my family pleaded, argued, and finally broke beneath the humiliation. I watched from the balcony above, hidden behind sheer curtains, my heart pounding as years of rejection played in reverse. For once, the world saw them not as flawless hosts of perfection, but as outsiders desperate for entry. The irony was sharp, almost cruel, yet I felt no guilt. They had excluded me my entire life. Now they would learn what it felt like to stand on the other side of the gate. The ceremony itself unfolded like a symphony. Daniel stood at the altar, his eyes locked on mine, his presence steady and strong. As I walked down the aisle, the world seemed to fall away. The whispers of disgrace, the laughter of cousins, the cold glares of my parents, all of it dissolved into the soft melody of music and the warmth of his gaze. When I reached him, he took my hand. And in that moment, I knew every tear, every wound, every rejection had led me here. We spoke our vows with voices thick with emotion, promising not only love but resilience, partnership, and truth. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause, the ocean roared as though celebrating with us, and my heart soared higher than it ever had. That night, under a canopy of stars, as fireworks burst across the sky, I allowed myself to exhale. The world had seen the truth. The girl they once called a disgrace had become a bride admired by millions. And the family who had mocked me stood outside the gates, silenced by the weight of their own cruelty. In the weeks after the wedding, the story spread far beyond Malibu. News outlets replayed the footage of celebrities and leaders arriving, the vows spoken beneath the arch of flowers, the fireworks streaking across the night sky. But what caught the most attention was not the grandeur of the celebration. It was the moment my family was turned away at the gates, their indignation captured by dozens of cameras, broadcast live to an audience hungry for scandal. Clips of my mother arguing with the guards were replayed with commentary that cut like blades. Headlines called it the downfall of a family that had once prided itself on perfection. My father's red face and raised voice became the subject of late-night jokes, and Allison's furious outburst, where she screamed that the wedding was nothing but a charade, trended online for days. Viewers dissected her words, hair gestoornis, hair desperation. The world saw what I had always known. Their pride was a fragile mask, easily shattered when they were denied the spotlight. At first, I felt overwhelmed. To live my pain in such a public way, to have strangers discuss the fractures of my family as entertainment, was jarring. Yet with every headline, every whispered comment, I felt a strange sense of release. For years, I had been the one humiliated, the one mocked, the one whose failures were displayed. Now, the roles had reversed. It was my family standing in the harsh glare of public judgment, their image of superiority crumbling for all to see. But the true reckoning came later. Reports began to circulate questioning the finances of Allison's charitable foundation. Journalists dug deeper, uncovering evidence that donations had been redirected into personal accounts, that scholarships promised to struggling students had never been granted. Photographs surfaced of lavish vacations and luxury purchases, all traced back to the charity's funds. What had once been her shining achievement, the pedestal on which my parents had placed her, collapsed overnight. I watched as the story unfolded, each revelation cutting another thread from the tapestry of her carefully constructed image. My parents tried to defend her at first, claiming it was a misunderstanding, but the evidence was undeniable. The public turned quickly, their admiration souring into outrage. Suddenly, Allison was no longer the golden child. She was the fraud, the deceiver, the fallen idol. Through it all, I remained silent. I did not gloat, did not point to the headlines and say, "I told you so." I simply lived my life with Daniel, building the foundation he had dreamed of, investing in programs that brought real change to communities. Together, we created something genuine, something that gave hope rather than false promises. And with every project completed, every scholarship granted, the contrast between us grew clearer. Where Allison's foundation had deceived, ours restored trust. Where she had taken, we gave. The day came when I received a letter from my grandfather's lawyer, one that revealed a truth long hidden. He had left me his estate, his legacy, his trust. My parents had concealed it, hoping to erase me from his will, but his instructions had been precise. He had seen me all along, even when they had not. The news shook me to my core, not because of the wealth or the land, but because it proved something I had yearned for my entire life, that someone in my family had believed in me. When my parents finally reached out, their voices carried a desperation I had never heard before. They wanted to meet, to explain, to beg forgiveness. They asked to attend the grand reception Daniel and I were hosting, claiming they were ready to reconcile. I read their words carefully, then wrote my reply with steady hands. 2 words only, too late. In the quiet after the storm, I often found myself reflecting on the strange path that had carried me here. There were nights when I would sit on the balcony of the Malibu estate, the ocean whispering against the cliffs, and remember the girl I had been, the one who held torn invitations in trembling hands. the one who begged silently for love that never came. She felt like a ghost now, a shadow I had finally stepped away from. And yet, she was also the reason I had become the woman I was. Without her pain, without her longing, I would not have found the strength to rise. Life with Daniel became a rhythm of purpose and joy. Together, we traveled to communities that had been forgotten, speaking with children whose dreams felt fragile, with families who needed hope more than promises. Each time we shook a hand, funded a program, or launched a scholarship, I felt a piece of myself heal. The world that once called me a disgrace now looked to me as an example of resilience. People sent letters, messages, stories of how they had felt cast aside by their families too, and how my journey had given them courage. I learned something important during those days. Vindication was not about revenge. It was not about watching my family stumble beneath the weight of their own lies, though that had its own cruel satisfaction. Vindication was about standing in the light of truth and realizing I no longer needed their approval. I had outgrown their judgment. I had built something far stronger than their fleeting praise. Still, there were moments when their absence ached like an old wound. Holidays would come, and I would remember the long tables of my childhood, the way laughter had always flowed around me but never to me. Now those tables were gone, replaced by gatherings with people who chose me, who celebrated me for who I was. Friends, colleagues, mentors, strangers whose lives had touched mine, they became the family I had always longed for. And slowly, the ache faded, replaced by gratitude for the new bonds I had forged. One afternoon, months after the headlines about Allison's fraud had quieted, I received a letter in handwriting I instantly recognized. It was my mother's. Her words were softer this time, stripped of the arrogance that had once laced every sentence. She wrote of regret, of sleepless nights, of a longing to turn back time. She said she missed me, that she wished she had seen me for who I was before it was too late. For a long while, I held the letter, my hands trembling with the weight of everything it carried. I could not bring myself to reply. Not because I hated her, I no longer did, but because the distance between us had grown too vast. She had built walls for decades, and though she now reached across them, my heart had already moved on. I whispered a quiet farewell in my mind, a release of the chains I had carried since childhood. Some doors, once closed, are not meant to be opened again. As the sun set that evening, Daniel wrapped his arms around me and asked what I was thinking. I smiled softly, tears glistening in my eyes. I told him I was thinking about how far I had come, about how the girl once called a disgrace had become a woman defined not by rejection but by resilience. He kissed my cheek, and in that simple gesture, I felt everything I had ever needed: love, acceptance, belonging. And so my story became not one of bitterness, but of transformation. My family's cruelty had once threatened to define me, but in truth, it had only sharpened me. The fire they lit to destroy me became the flame that carried me forward. And as I looked out over the endless horizon of the ocean, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I was finally free.